Good morning. This is being recorded on Monday, the 20th of March, which also happens to be the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, which is not totally irrelevant to today's discussion, because one could argue that the decline of US influence in the world and how the US was perceived dates back not just to the Vietnam War, but even more tangibly to the Iraqi War. But let me start at the beginning. I want to talk about power and influence in a multipolar world, but allow me to start by saying that students of international affairs historically have always divided power into two. One called hard power, which were arms, for example, military, sometimes economic strength, resources, and so forth, and soft power, which historically meant essentially diplomacy and various ways to influence countries, which you might have had soft power without having hard power, or you might have had hard power without having soft power. But in the best of all possible worlds, if you were going to be very influential in world affairs, you needed both hard and soft power. Now, coming out of the Second World War, we know that many countries were decimated by the war, but we also know we came out in a bipolar world. There was bipolar, not necessarily in terms of economic strength, but in terms of reputation, influence, different systems of governance, and soon very hard power, namely nuclear capacity. And then we also know that in due time, after the end of the Cold War, the US was the only quote unquote power standing in the world. And during this period of the post end of the Cold War and now, the question arises, A, what has happened to US power? And B, how do we become a multipolar world? Well, in some senses, it depends on what you're looking at. For example, since there was a distribution, not necessarily distribution, but an expansion of countries having nuclear power, for example, Pakistan and India, and there was a concern, even during the Cold War, that while there were two dominant powers in the nuclear realm, just the nuclear realm, it was problematic because in that sense, it was multipolar, right? So that's why you had arms control treaties and so on, trying to make sure that people would not use nuclear weapons as a first strike. So the hard power of military power started dividing itself between nuclear power and other military capacity, size of the army's capability, and so on. So let me just again take this sort of between the end of World War II and the end of Cold War period and say that Europe in general revived from the Second World War and got rebuilt and became quite strong, both in, by and large, both in hard military power and capacity. Again, nuclear capacity in France and the United Kingdom. And also obviously revived its economies and became fairly strong economies. Then you had the development of the European Union, which strengthened the whole group and the whole bloc. Originally, European Union was made out of 6 members. It eventually moved into much larger numbers. at the end of the Cold War, some of Eastern Europe joined the European Union. So now you have a much larger union. And all of these events, so to speak, enabled countries in Europe to feel, if not as powerful as the United States, but certainly to play a role. And in this sense, became a pole in the first bilateral world, and then when the U.S. was a unilateral power after the end of the Cold War. But Europe, increasingly felt that it had a role to play, sometimes an independent role. The development of NATO meant that there was a military capacity, in other words, hard power, which included the European states, but also included non-European states, for example, United States, Canada, Turkey, and so on. So power, in some senses, is a relational concept as well, which is power to do what, right? So in the case of hard power, whether or not you have an army and weaponry, or whether you have nuclear capacity, and for what purpose those are available to be used to pursue your policies, is a fairly complex business. But nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. came out as, the ongoing most powerful country, certainly in military terms and also in economic terms. And even to this day, the U.S. is the largest military power and the largest economy in the world. That day is quickly coming to an end in terms of China, or may already be to an end of China in terms of its economy, but never mind. But I want to say that during this period, where the U.S. was in a position, in a sense, to be able to influence and to have the dominant say in world affairs, you then had U.S. domestic policy and a world in which communications started becoming really important and very different. The world looked at the U.S. and said, they're not so great. Their politics aren't so great. Their international role is not always so great. And then you had Iraq, and that made the fiat, which I think most people agree now was a fiasco, that made the U.S. look less competent. We preached our values of democracy and so forth. Of course, people who were educated knew about American slavery and the state of the U.S. Treatment of people of color. That very often reduced our influence, the soft power capability in some parts of the world. But, in general, the U.S. seemed to be the sort of dominant power. Russia had declined. People weren't paying a lot of attention to the fact that increasingly Europe and other parts of the world became dependent on Russian energy, gas, oil, and so on. So there wasn't a lot of attention, especially on the part of citizens, that slowly U.S. hard power may not have been eroding, but U.S. soft power was eroding in the world. And parallel to that was the development of some other countries. For example, China, which was a very poor country some decades ago, became an economic powerhouse. And China used to play almost no international role whatsoever. It confined itself to developing its own society. So it's only really in recent times, in the last decade, but even more so under Xi, that China has decided it's going to play an international role as well. And it has done so in two regards. One is in economically, that in terms of investing in other countries, the Road and Belt initiatives, developing roads, highways, whatever, in lots of countries in the so-called South, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America to some extent. And so, from the perspective not of the US, but from the perspective of those countries, a new power, so to speak, namely China, became an important or played an important role in the domestic economies and politics of countries. We were still preoccupied mainly with our, importance in the world. And then Trump came along, and Trump fueled in the United States something which is still ongoing, a notion of isolationism, which says, well, we're actually not that interested in getting involved here, there, and yonder. I should backtrack and say our lack of involvement in the Syrian conflict, which was under Obama, not Trump, also played a role of saying, the US is picking and choosing where it gets involved and allows others, in this particular case of Syria, Russia, to take the lead. But, we don't really have to be busy everywhere in the world. We're a very strong economy, very strong country, and everybody in the world knows that we're the reigning democracy. Well, as a matter of fact, in the last 20 years or so, everybody in the world doesn't necessarily look at us as the reigning democracy. Yes, we have a wonderful constitution, and up until recently, we seem to have fairly flawless elections. But at the same time, democracies are expected to look out after their population. And if you compare, let us say, the quality of life in some of the Scandinavian countries, their ability to look out after their citizens' education and health, and the very mixed and often very bad circumstances of essentially American poor people in terms of health and education. Was shocking to very many parts of the world to learn through the media now that's available to everybody to what extent, large numbers of children in the United States are poor and don't even have enough to eat at home, and it's for school lunches that they're able to get some reasonable diet. We may all recall that under Ronald Reagan, he thought that tomato sauce was an adequate vegetable. So all of these kinds of things allowed people who were looking closely at the United States to say, it's not such a fair and socially just country, and we don't necessarily want to imitate that. So in a sense, America's virtues, America's democracy, America presenting itself as the role model from the world, became somewhat more diffuse in the minds of many people. And that was accelerated by the revolution in technology and the media, so that people who typically in various parts of the world only had access to reasonable information, let's say about the United States or Russia or China, were people who were literate or had access to TV. But increasingly, the internet, the iPhones, the media in general, was able to purvey information that made the U.S. look less like this shining star on the horizon that everybody wanted to imitate. And along comes China, which now is feeling, and let's say increasingly in the last 10 years, is feeling that economically it is doing very well, and deciding that it now has a role to play in the world. And not only in the terms of sort of ideologically and political outreach, but mainly in economic outreach and helping countries in the very way that they would need to be helped. Food production, economic betterment, and the flip side of it all is, of course, that China, which sort of seemed or sounded essentially charitable in terms of its contribution to the development of other countries, had, of course, a very specific self-interest, namely for the purpose of the Chinese economy developing. It needed the raw materials and the resources that are buried in the ground in so many countries all over the world. So when you talk copper, nickel, lithium, all these things which are mined and for which there is raw material that can be mined in Africa and South America, for example, it is, of course, in Chinese interests to align itself and to be a friendly economic partner. On the one hand, helping those countries develop, on the other hand, getting the resources that China needs to develop. So one can say very clearly that besides Europe and the United States, and as we learn now in the Ukrainian war, Russia, which is willing to deprive its own societies and its own people of life and liberty in order to, do this crazy invasion. I think historically it will be seen crazy in Russian history in the Ukraine. But sort of America is not the only actor out there. And that also meant that increasingly Russia decided, well, it's got to compete out there. And one of the ways it's sought to compete, especially under Putin, was to get busy competing not just with the US and Europe, but also with China. So that as we speak, Russia has troops in about Russian troops in about 16 countries, either national troops, but mostly the mercenaries of the Wagner group. In various West African countries, for example. I've mentioned that before, sometimes in support of the reigning dictator in the country, and sometimes in support of opposition groups and guerrilla movements trying to overthrow the current government. So it doesn't necessarily come down on one side or the other, it depends on the country. It also is a big supplier of arms. So Russian countries are dependent on Russian arms, are about 22, 25 countries, mostly people say 22, and includes countries that we in the United States view as democratic, and we believe that we, rather than China or Russia, have a big influence. Let's take India, for example, which will be the largest country in terms of population any day. And is, clearly another pole in world affairs, clearly in terms of its size. Where does India get its arms from? Russia, it turns out, right? Where do many of these other countries, these other 22 countries around the world get their arms from? Turns out Russia. Well, you get around to having a Ukrainian issue and you say, well, why doesn't India throw its weight in support of the Ukraine and the Western countries and sits on the fence and tries to mediate and be somewhat neutral? Well, it's rather dependent on Russian arms. It is fairly dependent to some extent also on other Russian resources. So that on the one hand, India itself is now a pole in the multipolar world in terms of influence, in terms of size, in terms of climate change, for example. On the other hand, older actors like Russia also continue to have some influence on those countries. What I'm sketching here, just to make sense out of it all, is that in this world, which is now multipolar, India, Turkey, Iran, and so on. These countries all have developed capacity, sometimes hard power, like in the case of Iran, in very close nuclear power any moment now. Some countries have roles to play that are intermediary in their region. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, which is a very big country with a small population, with a less than democratic government, but which is has power, quote unquote, and influence because of its oil, right? This is a form of hard power. They are now in the position of saying, well, we want to be a tangible and somewhat major actor in the region. And with that in mind, you might have seen in the newspaper Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are unlikely friends because Saudi Arabia is Sunni, Iran, I'm sorry, is a Shiite Muslim country. And who brought these two countries together? China. So here you see an interesting kind of development. On the one hand, China is one of the global powers now. On the other hand, it is also playing a global power in getting other power, lower level powers, but nevertheless powers in their region together to overlap, possibly cooperate. It's unclear how the relationship with Iraq and Iran will go, but it means that the bringing these two countries together and indicating to them that they have common interest in the region of the Middle East is potentially creating a new pole in the Middle East. Yes, there's Egypt, but Egypt is at the moment not in a position to play a very major role. Yes, there's Israel, and we all know what's happening in Israel, right? It's a total mess. And in any event, Israel is, even after the Abraham Accords, which led Israel and the Gulf states to recognize each other and all the rest of it, Israel internally is now in such a mess that this is actually a very good opportunity for some of the other Middle East countries. One has to be careful to not say just Arab countries, because Iran is not an Arab nation, not an Arab state. I think you mostly will know that what constitutes an Arab state is a state in which people speak Arabic. So it is not Islam that makes an Arab state. It is the fact that Arabic is the language. So you have, but the Middle East has, both Arabic states and, in this case, non-Arabic states, or only partially Arab states. So there are unifications and power hubs that can be created in the Middle East based on shared Middle East concerns, right? So, all right, so you have China, you have potentially India, you have a rising and dynamic situation in the Middle East, both Iran and Turkey playing a major role. In the case of Turkey, playing both with the West and members of NATO. On the other hand, also playing and with some military aircraft trade and so forth with Russia. So that sort of gives the Middle East either single or multipolar activity. Then you have Africa. Is there a power player in the multipolar world in Africa? Not really, because South Africa, which could have played that role, is itself in not very good shape. But there is Nigeria for the rest of the century. And Nigeria, as we know, has 1.2 billion or 3 population. It too has oil. It is in political disarray as we speak. but something on the order of 40% of the African population by the end of the century is thought to be Nigerian, unless its birth rate changes drastically. So Nigeria is potentially another pole for Africa. Then you get to Latin America. Well, then it gets complicated because potentially, again, a major country with a major population with major potential is, of course, Brazil. Brazil has, tried to play a role, not very happily in Latin American affairs and so on. But these things change over a decade. It's unclear to what extent the current Brazilian government can right the ship, so to speak, make it a more democratic society again, make a major contribution for climate change, because the sinkhole of the air pollution in the world, or a major sinkhole, is in Brazil in the rainforest, right? So I seem to be rambling, but let me point out that it's a moving train here. That is to say, what is clear is that the US is not the single pole anymore, that Russia can, without having necessarily a good politics, or for that matter, a good economy, still has technological capacity and is willing to use its military to upset the apple cart in Europe. Europe increasingly looked like it would be a strong pole in the world, with both hard and soft power. And Europe is also sort of fraying at the moment. Not the European Union as an institution, but look at the mess in France right now. The French government may in fact disintegrate under this crazy business of them not wanting to change their retirement age from 62 to 64. That's only comprehensible in French terms, because most countries are raising their retirement ages. England has been, the United Kingdom has been something of a mess. Can they right the ship and be, an important actor? But England, having left the European Union, is in serious economic difficulty. So yes, there is Europe, and Europe still has, many democratic countries in its midst in the European Union. But that too is somewhat tarnished by the fact that, as I said, there's trouble in their hills. And some of the East European countries, for example, Poland, which we all think so well of right now, is actually a very right-wing authoritarian government, right? And as is Hungary. So then none of that looks so good. So what am I saying in the world? I'm saying actually we're in the middle of a transition and a mess. The transition is the US is no longer able to play the kind of role it used to play. It can play that role militarily, but not in terms of soft power, in terms of influence. Second, I'm saying that Russia is much diminished and will be much diminished after this war goes over. But it's also diminished because its major resource and its major strength in the post-Cold War period was the dependence of Europe and others on its natural resources, oil and gas, and countries are getting weaned off of those fairly quickly. I'm saying India is a rising power unless its increasingly authoritarian leader, Mr. Modi, blows the place up. I'm saying the Middle East can't be discounted, and Iraq and Turkey are certainly serious second layer powers, both in the region and potentially elsewhere. I'm saying that sometime in the next decade or two, one or more African states may become their own power center with some leverage. And in Latin America, there are a number of potentially and actually viable countries. And what I'm also saying is that U.S. influence, both in terms of hard power and its ability or willingness to use it, and its soft power, its diplomacy, its role model for democracy, its role model for how to run a society, especially, is badly frayed. So we're definitely living in a multipolar world right now. How this all settles in, we are in a transitional phase. So there's some things one can say with assurance. We're not in a unipolar world. And the role of the US has sharply declined. And the internal politics of the United States is increasingly going isolationist, both amongst Democrats and Republicans, which means even further reduction. And one of the dominant issues in the world is not just democracy, but how to survive climate change. And that will allow countries to try to become role models, try to play a role. And finally, I want to say that all of these sort of old-fashioned ways of looking at things, poles of power, bipolar, multipolar, and so forth, are on shaky ground, not militarily in terms of hard power or even economic power, but also in terms of the degree to which large populations can play an outside role in terms of climate change and how climate change will impact how one looks at a multipolar world is yet unclear, because there are second-run countries, for example, large countries like Indonesia, which don't at the moment play a large role in the world, but which actually and potentially are really, really important in terms of climate change. Right? So climate change is as yet somewhat of an unknown variable. The other thing that's still an unknown variable is to what extent technology, communications, instant communications, technology changing the way people live and so forth, will either reduce the sort of more old-fashioned way of looking at polarities in economic, military, and more philosophically influence kind of ways, and to what extent technology will override what we have historically always viewed as a way of determining who has power and influence and who doesn't. It's all in transition. And I think the best way to look at it all when we read the daily news is to imagine that what has so far not been imagined in world affairs may come to pass, namely the degree to which climate change changes the world, the degree to which the US further erodes its role model of being anything proximate to a democracy, in which case populations will demand more equality, a better quality of life, and who can provide it. There are all kinds of unknown variables. I think, however, that when you look and when our children and grandchildren look back to this era of this particular time in history, what they will be able to see is a fairly big mess that is not explained particularly well by old ways of looking at things, of 200 different countries. Exactly what role they will play in the future is not clear. A malfunctioning of many of the international institutions. I mean, the UN is limping along, but there are many things it can no longer do because it's structured in a way that no longer makes particular sense. It's non-governmental organizations and the role they play, how easy it is to be transnational nowadays, communications and all the rest of it make for a very messy, a porous, gray transition right now. And that, of course, means that many of us are saying, oh, this is too complicated, too crisis. Every day there's another different crisis, too complicated. We're just going to tune out. And that, of course, especially when things, democracy and participation on the part of populations is really, really central and important, is not called for, and we need to work very hard, it seems to me, as individuals and as cities and countries, states, to counter the idea of let's leave it to some kind of experts, what the hell they're doing, I don't really care, and or let's isolate ourselves from the world and only care about Santa Cruz or California or the United States. Those days have gone away because of the kind of technological, environmental, etc. world we happen to live in. So I know this has been an unsatisfactory talk, but rather than cleaning up the mess, I wanted to demonstrate that it is in fact a mess. Thank you very much, and talk to you again in 2 weeks.